Happy Friday to everyone. We're going to be doing some notes on Henry David Thoreau and going over the context of his essay, Civil Disobedience. Keep in mind you got this essay yesterday in class, and we're going to be doing a quiz for it next Thursday, which is going to be October the 20th. Now remember, for that quiz, and it is a very detailed quiz, short answer, fill in the blank type of questions, that you are allowed to bring in notes for the quiz. You cannot bring in the article itself, bring in the essay, so highlighted copies of the essay, things like that don't count. But you, on notebook paper, you can bring in notes that you would like for it. It's not a limit for 1 page like we have had in the past. So if you have 3, 4, or 5 pages of notes for Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, that is entirely your call. I'm fine with that. Keep in mind, though, it does have to be handwritten, so you're not going to be coming in with a printed out copy of additional notes. You're not shrinking the font down to 2 points and printing out copies of it or anything along those lines. But any handwritten notes that you have for the essay, you are allowed to use those for your quiz that you're going to have next Thursday. Keep in mind, today's Friday, so you have a weekend coming up. For Monday, when you come in, we'll be doing the TWA for the Catcher in the Rye. You received the prompt for that earlier in the week. I guess that was on Wednesday. Just like we did with the TWA, the DRQ this week, you can have notes on that prompt, use that in class. You cannot use your book in class, so copies of the book are not acceptable, but any notes that you have on the prompt itself, you're able to use that. Just like, again, with this week, if you forget to, you don't happen to have your prompt with you, you forget it, something happens to it over the course of the weekend, I'll have copies available of the prompt for you to use on Monday. Keep in mind it's DRQ, but also that analysis aspect to it, so please make sure you do emphasize significance of the work as a whole when it comes to Holden's madness and why it matters. Other things going on next week, you have the PSAT on Wednesday, so periods 1 through 4, you're going to be testing for the PSAT. If you're in 5th period or 7th period with me, we'll have class, but it'll be a fairly light day considering that I won't be seeing 1st period or 4th period. And then, as mentioned, the Thoreau quiz is going to be next Thursday, and again, you can have notes. The other thing to keep in mind for Thursday of next week is you're going to be selecting your independent reading novel at that point. You have the list of books on your weekly syllabus: The Great Gatsby, A Farewell to Arms, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. You have The Awakening by Kate Chopin, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and George Orwell's 1984. Ultimately, from that list, you're going to be reading 2 of the books. So you're going to be doing 1 now, and then you'll be doing another one come December, going into January towards the end of the 1st semester. I have no preference as to which book you choose, so if you haven't really taken a look at any of them yet, I think over the weekend be a good idea going into next week. Ask around about the books. You could do a little bit of research, see which ones you think would work best. Of course, if you ask me the question, which book is my favorite, I will, of course, answer all of them. So make sure you do pick one that you think is going to work best for you. Again, notebook, we now have background for Henry David Thoreau and Civil Disobedience, so we're just going to go through some background of him to make sure we have a better understanding of what would be going on within his essay. So we got Henry David Thoreau. He has an impressive beard. That's the first thing that we're going to generally kind of recognize about him, so extra credit assignment for anyone who grows a Henry David Thoreau beard. No, Halloween costume beards are not going to count. Thoreau himself, from a timeline standpoint where we're taking a look at, he's born July 12, 1817. He's from Massachusetts. Thoreau is, considered to be one of the New England writers, essayists that when we think about early to mid-19th century in the 1800s, a lot of the thinkers of that era are also coming from New England. So that's really where you have a lot of universities, colleges, things of that nature. Really, New England tends to kind of be the bustling part of the country. It's not what we would think of quite yet in today's world. New York City, Washington, D.C., more that mid-Atlantic range being the hub of the country. At this point, it probably really is New England, especially with industrial factories, that type of consumerism is really going to be taking place in the Northeast. Birth name is actually David Henry. He's named after an uncle of his who died when he was younger, before Thoreau was born. So he's is named after the uncle, but he preferred to go by Henry David. And we refer to him as Thoreau. Linguists go that probably when he was alive, his actual name would have been more like Thoreau. as in someone was doing a thorough reading of a book. So Henry David Thoreau, but we've kind of changed the pronunciation, the emphasis to being that of Thoreau. From the quote that we have from Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of the Scarlet Letter, you can tell that people are not always complimentary about his looks. Certainly being described ugly as sin is never really a good thing. However, you take a look at the last line, but his ugliness is of an honest and agreeable fashion and becomes him much better than beauty. Folks really kind of consider Thoreau to be an outdoorsman, one who tries to take a look at the importance of nature and whatnot. So a very rugged look, an honest man, somebody who would be very affable, easy to get along with. So while he might not have the looks that people would necessarily always consider to be ideal, personality, thought process, those things are certainly characteristics of his that people look at with a kind viewpoint and look. Just quick little background about him, 1833 to 1837, so again, born in 1817, so this would be when he's 16 years old and going into age 18 and 19. He does study at Harvard. Harvard certainly is still a well-established school in today's time, and back then is very widely regarded. Young, not necessarily really for that age, because keep in mind you don't have a formal school system the way that we do now. So by today's standards, 16 years certainly would be very young for him to be going to Harvard. Wouldn't necessarily call that unusual, although he is regarded, certainly at the time as being a very intelligent young man. Harvard is a little bit in his blood. Grandfather of his went to Harvard as well. His father did not. His father is a pencil maker. So Ticonderogas go all the way back to Thoreau, although that's not the specific pencil that they made at the time. But he ends up going to Harvard. There he becomes friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson, who we're going to be talking about here a little bit later on, also well regarded as a 19th century thinker in that New England era within the United States. When he comes back from school, he and his brother, Thoreau and his brother, open up a grammar school, basically one of those one-room schoolhouse type of deals where you'd be looking at elementary age children. Him and his brother have that school that they open and run in 1838 through 1841. However, when his brother dies of tetanus, Thoreau ends up having to close the school because there's not enough support, enough money to keep it running at that time. And basically half of the labor force, the two teachers, were him and his brother. Since half of that force has been lost, the school ends up having to close. And so it's at that time in 1841, 1842, when Thoreau ends up making some adjustments to his life that end up having a pretty significant impact with the way that we end up viewing him. Mentioned to you that he was friends with Emerson when he went to school in Harvard. In 1843, he actually moves in with Ralph Waldo Emerson and his family, and the idea is that he's going to be the children's tutor primarily, although he kind of becomes the handyman of the family. So he would be the person who would help fix up any kind of house projects that are taking place, as well as teaching the children, taking care of them on a day-to-day basis and whatnot. So it really does become an integral part of the family. Emerson has a very large estate, and he has a large wooded area that butts up against a place called Walden Pond, and this is also outside of Concord in Massachusetts. And from 1845 to 1847, while Thoreau is still working for Emerson and the family, he moves to Walden Pond. So he leaves the creature comforts of the home and actually builds himself a little shed, a little cabin, which we'll show you some pictures of here in a moment. Really, you're looking at the size of something 10 by 10, 12 by 12, so not very large at all, and ends up living outside in this cabin by Walden Pond for roughly 2 years. Goes over the span of 3 years, but really it's a 24-month period that he's really trying to become one with nature. The whole idea of self-discovery, finding your soul, who you really are, those are some of the things that Thoreau is trying to do at this point. 1849 is when Civil Disobedience is published, the essay that you are reading for Thursday of next week. And again, we'll get into some of the backdrop of that and the issues that he has with the government at the time. 1854 is when he publishes his most famous full-length work, Walden. Civil Disobedience is an essay. Walden is a full-length book, and it basically is accounting for his experience when he lives at Walden Pond. So, should you decide that you want to read what it would be like to live outside for 2 years, Walden would be the book for you to check out. And of all things, they actually turned it into a video game a couple of years ago for, I think it was PlayStation, came out with a Walden video game. I don't think it probably sold very well. I don't think living outside the pond really had a whole big appeal for an audience to play on a 54-inch TV, watching the fish and frogs do their daily thing. 1862 is when Thoreau dies from bronchitis, deals with variable illnesses in his later years. Now, 1862, keep in mind, this would be when Lincoln is president. The Civil War has started to take place, which begins in 1861. So again, born in 1817, early parts of the 19th century, War of 1812, shortly thereafter, to the Civil War. So from a context standpoint, really the first half, roughly, of the 19th century. And one of the things Thoreau is famous for are his dying words. He has the phrase, "Now comes good sailing," followed by awkward pause, and then says two more words, moose and Indian, before he ultimately passes away. So, when you are on Jeopardy sometime in the future, and what famous writer's dying words were moose and Indian, you'll be able to know that it was Henry David Thoreau. So, keep that information in your back pocket. Walden Pond, mentioned this to you. 1845 is when he decides to live in a simple cabin. Now notice he does this in July, so the weather's a little bit nicer compared to what it would be come December, January, but he stays there nonetheless. He's on the Emerson property, and he decides that society, the outside world, in today's world we would talk about maybe mass media, social media, how it would influences a person's thoughts and feelings and relationships. That's not taking place in 1845 to the extent that we would think in 2016, but he really wants to try to get an escape from the outside world. He is not becoming a hermit. He's not becoming a total recluse the way that we kind of think of with J.D. Salinger, but he wants to kind of get himself involved in simple living. Now, he still does go to town. He still does have his studies that he's doing with the Emerson household, taking care of the kids. He still is kind of the handyman of the property itself, so he is interacting with people, but he's doing it on a much less regular basis than what would normally be taking place. Most of his day, at least good half of his day, would just be him, solitude, a little bit of isolation at Walden Pond. But again, this is on the property itself, so it's not like he's going 20 miles away from his job or his home in order to do this experiment. So it does kind of work in some ways where you don't have to go too far. Any emergencies take place, he is still able to be in contact with people, get necessary resources and things like that. But ultimately, he's trying to leave behind the rigors and the overall structure of society so he can find a little bit more about who he is truly, spiritually, morally, all of those things. Picture is a reconstruction of the cabin. If you go to Walden Pond, there's a statue of Henry David Thoreau, and you can see the cabin there, fairly small, with a little lean-to of wood that he would use to heat the place. This really would basically be the size of what would be a typical shed, probably in suburbia of North Hills. Might even be a little bit smaller than a typical shed that you would see in some homes. Picture of the cabin. And also we'll have a quick little picture of what would be inside. You can see very simple living, basically desk, chair, stove, small bed that he would use to sleep in, more of a cot or anything, and that's about it. So this is where he's doing some writing, some studying. Thoreau is very interested with Indian culture, not Native American, but Indian culture so far as Hinduism. And Buddhism somewhat, so things such as yoga, meditation, those are all aspects of the culture that he is trying to embrace. So in some ways very forward thinking, because these have certainly become trendy in some way so far as viewpoints of the world, but he would be one of those pioneers. In 19th century New England, you're not going to have too many people practicing yoga, meditation, and things like that to get a stronger sense of self, personal well-being, identity, things of that nature. With this is really when he becomes associated with transcendentalism. Transcendentalism is rooted in thoughts of German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and this ends up being embraced by a lot of the 19th century New England writers and thinkers as an alternative to John Locke's idea of sensationalism, which he brings forth in his essay concerning humor understanding from 1690. Transcendentalism, again, the whole idea would be that you are trying to disassociate yourself from the structures, from the rigors of society, from the influences of society. This could be political influences, this could be social influences, this could be some economic influences, consumerism, materialism, things of that nature. Certainly could be influences from employment, depending upon the type of job a person is pursuing. Could also be religious viewpoints. So the whole idea that rather than being a vessel that is influenced by outside external forces, transcendentalists want to kind of find what is pure within them. So Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, poet William Longfellow, these would all be folks who you kind of get the transcendentalist movement, very popular mid to late 19th century. So in the 1840s, certainly Thoreau is going to kind of be in the heyday. And even though his living situation is a little unusual of the time, living by Walden Pond, Thoreau is still involved within the circle of writers and thinkers and able to certainly share his philosophic viewpoints of different things. So the whole hope with the transcendentalism, with his living in the cabin, is he is able to get himself removed from these external outside forces such as religion and politics that could end up corrupting the natural goodness of people. So whereas John Locke would look at people as being an empty body or an empty vessel, and you need all of these external sensations to figure out who you are, transcendentalists, just as Henry David Thoreau would go, there is a natural goodness or a natural essence within a person, that inner spiritual, mental essence of the human, and you do not need those outside religions or beliefs in order to figure out who you are. So peace and satisfaction come from within the person, come from that inner spiritual mental essence that already pre-exists within the human body, and anything else from the outside world simply tampers with that natural kind of beauty that would exist within a person's mind, body, soul. So again, transcendentalism, you're trying to essentially transcend those outside forces that could end up being somewhat corrupting to the body. And within civil disobedience, even though it's not meant to be a transcendentalist work or an essay or a type of writing that is promoting transcendentalism, you certainly can still see some of those viewpoints coming through within civil disobedience. Going back to Walden Pond, mentioned he moves there in 1845. In 1846, on a time when he does go back into town in Concord, he ends up being arrested by the tax collector due to not paying his taxes for the past 6 years. So 2016, Donald Trump's tax returns are big news or big story. In 1846 in Concord, Massachusetts, it was Henry David Thoreau's tax returns or lack of paying taxes that is a big deal. And one of the things that you'll read about within civil disobedience, or you already have read about, would be the poll tax, P-O-L-L tax. And the poll tax is an important thing to understand because we don't really have it anymore. The poll tax would be the church tax of the era. So money from the citizens would be going to the local churches. And one of the things that Thoreau complains about is, why should I pay a tax to one institution but I can't pay a tax to another institution, and mentions education. And of course the irony with that is, in today's world, those things have been flipped, where basically you have a property tax if you own land, property within a township. That property tax, or at least a large portion of it, does go back to supporting the schools. So in his time, it's money that he's worried about going not only to the church but to the government as well. And basically he decides that he's not going to pay his taxes. So by him spending a night in jail, because his bail was paid the following day, no one knows for sure who has paid for it, but the assumption is that an aunt of his or an aunt of his ends up paying for his bail. But he spends one night in jail, and that kind of becomes the impetus for him writing Civil Disobedience. Keep in mind, this is occurring in 1846. Civil Disobedience comes a few years later. In 1849 is when it is published. So there is some recollection as to what's going back. In part 2 of Civil Disobedience, and the second of the 3 parts that you have, is really when he kind of mentions his night in jail. But for the most part, that's not a point that he keeps going back to over and over and over again. The main reason that Thoreau refuses to pay his taxes is he does not want to support a government that he feels is corrupt. And so he does not like the idea about paying a war tax, which is going to go to support the Mexican-American War. And he does not want to pay a tax to a country which will still support slavery. Again, 1846, 1849, publication of civil disobedience, slavery still is legal within the United States. Now, he does not live in a slave state, being in New England and Massachusetts, but his argument is that he should not pay any money to a state or a federal government which supports slavery or allows for it to happen. And he argues that Massachusetts and northern states do still support slavery because of the commerce that takes place with the southern states. So any kind of trade, you have a large textile business that's going to be taking place in the manufacturing hub of Boston and the rest of New England. Where are they getting all the cotton that they are using for their textiles manufacturing? It's coming from the South. So the fact that the Massachusetts government still does trade with the southern states, he views as being a support of slavery. The Mexican-American War, in his mind, is an extension of that slavery because it's looking to annex Texas from Mexico. And so essentially he would be saying that that area is being taken over by force. You are taking land from a country that already has it, does not want to give it up. So in his mind, he looks at that as kind of being an extension of slavery, taking whatever we can get, using human labor in whatever way necessary for the benefit of the economy. And so Thoreau is very much against this. And when Thoreau's biography, he's certainly going to be described as being an essayist, as being a poet, a philosopher, but also recognized as being a fervent abolitionist. And in some ways, some folks will even go so far as to call him an anarchist, and that he's trying to overthrow government. And Thoreau is not a person who is going to come with rifle, pitchfork, torch, and overthrow the government by force. But he's doing a little bit more of a peaceful protest, or he's being disobedient in a civil manner in order to get his point across. And this is certainly an idea that other folks, take and run with as the years go by, especially when it comes to folks like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., who we'll mention here in a little bit. Again, just recapping, mentioned civil disobedience. It's written in 1849. Again, he's motivated by his night in jail to compose this essay, and it would get published in pamphlet form. So this isn't showing up in the newspaper. It's not getting, he's not doing a book signing or anything like that, but certainly would be ideas that are passed around to people. For the most part, it's not really widely accepted or heard. It's not that people don't disagree with him, but he does not have really a large following. And he'll get some agreement from people that, within his literary circles and philosophical circles, such as Thoreau, such as Emerson, Hawthorne, to an extent. But he doesn't really get a massive audience for it. And so it's not till years later, really turn of the 20th century, that people tend to really take note to civil disobedience and maybe the impact that it would have. So certainly his disgust with slavery, the Mexican-American War tends to be the impetus, the main points behind his writing of civil disobedience, but certainly would be able to extend to other issues as well. And probably the most famous line, and this would be where people sometimes might refer to him as being that of an anarchist, is that government is best which governs least, or that government is best which governs not at all. He would be someone who'd kind of be looking at a laissez-faire form of government and economics, where the government has as little control over everyday aspects as humanly possible. So when you talk about small government or big government working its way into multiple facets of a person's life, Thoreau would be someone who would be favoring small government, as little government interaction and influence as would be humanly possible. Which again, the idea of him being a transcendentalist, this makes perfect sense. Transcendentalism, you're trying to stay away from those outside influences, one of those influences being politics. And so a government is best which governs not at all. You have as little influence as possible from that government coming onto its everyday citizens. Mentioned to you Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi are two people who really look at the impact, the power of the essay Civil Disobedience. Certainly King's words, I was so deeply moved that I reread the work several times. No other person has been more eloquent and passionate in getting his ideas across than Henry David Thoreau. As a result of his writings and personal witness, we are heirs of a legacy of creative protest. And certainly when you think of peaceful protest, Martin Luther King is probably the first person who comes to mind, in the sense that you are being civilly disobedient in a non-violent manner, but also doing a citizen's kind of civil duty in being disobedient by sit-ins, protest in Martin Luther King's case, or with what Thoreau believes, not paying taxes. So certainly some domestic influence with Martin Luther King Jr., also some international influence when it comes to Gandhi in India. Again, Gandhi speaking about Thoreau, his ideas influenced me greatly. I adopted some of them and recommend the study of Thoreau to all my friends who are helping me in the cause of Indian independence. There is no doubt that Thoreau's ideas greatly influenced my movement in India. I will warn you, people who read civil disobedience tend to become upset by it. It can sound like a rant at times. Thoreau's ideas are not necessarily structured and focused. Those are two of the concepts that I tend to harp on the most when it comes to writing essays. Make sure you have a structured argument, a focused argument. Thoreau tends to be kind of scattered. From a logical fallacy standpoint, he will beg the question, where he will essentially do some circular reasoning, re-argue the same point multiple times, but do so with slightly different wording. So there are going to be some moments when you certainly are going to get fed up with him. I think it's a reading that you want to probably break up into multiple chunks. If you do it at one time, by the time you get towards the end of the text, you're going to have a hard time staying focused and paying attention to his main point. Or if you break it up, give yourself a little bit of a break, a rest, you can come back with maybe a clear, focused concept in mind. Keep in mind, Gandhi King find a lot of value in the words and the ideas that he is trying to get across. So while certainly it is easy to get frustrated with Thoreau's argument, or at least frustrated with the way he presents his argument, one of the things you want to ask yourself is, why do these two leaders, who most people generally regard as being two of the most thoughtful and determined, probably, leaders, if reformers, revolutionaries of the 20th century, why do these men find Thoreau's words to be so effective? So that certainly would be a question to kind of ask yourself while you were doing the reading, because it certainly can be easy maybe to become a little frustrated with Thoreau's ideas overall. So that's our quick little background for civil disobedience and Henry David Thoreau. Remember, reading notes. We're going to do a quiz for civil disobedience on Thursday of next week on the 20th. Probably the more immediate pressing assignment would be on Monday in class. You have your TWA for the catcher in the rye on the, I believe that's the 17th on Monday. So homework assignment really would be to make sure you're good to go with your brainstorming for the catcher in the rye. You can have your brainstorming on your prompt sheet, no notes for the TWA itself. Aside from that, your homework assignment would be the reading of civil disobedience, and then any notes that you want to bring handwritten for the quiz on Thursday you are allowed to do. I'll collect notes with quiz, but the notes are not worth a homework assignment or anything like that. So come with as much or as little as you want note-wise, whatever you think is going to be most useful for you when it comes to your quiz next Thursday. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. You can also send me a note on Remind. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to help.